Let's establish something uncomfortable right at the start, because dancing around it would cost you more than confronting it directly. The most dangerous person in your life is almost certainly not the one who has made their hostility obvious. It's not the colleague who rolls their eyes at your ideas in meetings, or the neighbor who makes their disdain visible every time you cross paths, or the family member who can't get through a dinner without a pointed remark. Those people, for all their unpleasantness, have made themselves legible. You know what you're dealing with. You've calibrated accordingly. The person who should concern you is the one whose face you'd never put on a list of threats. The one who remembers details about your life that you barely remember sharing. Who shows up in the right place with coffee and a warm question and complete, focused attention. Who laughs easily, agrees generously, and makes you feel, in their company, like you are genuinely known and genuinely liked. That person, the one reading this who just came to mind for you, is who this is about. Hatred, as a signal, is actually quite useful. It's loud, it's legible, and it gives you something to respond to. What doesn't announce itself, what the research in behavioral psychology and what the Stoic philosophers both point toward with unusual clarity, is the particular kind of threat that operates underneath warmth. The threat that wears patience as a strategy and kindness as camouflage. The threat that doesn't want you hurt in the heat of a moment. It wants you gone, carefully, at a time of its choosing. This video is not about fear. Fear makes you reactive and imprecise, which is exactly the state the people we're describing prefer you to be in. This is about discernment. The specific Stoic discipline of seeing the world as it actually is, rather than as you'd prefer it to be, and acting from that clarity rather than from either panic or denial. 5 signs. Specific, behavioral, observable. Not hunches. Not worst-case paranoia. Patterns that show up repeatedly in the documented psychology of people who intend serious harm to someone in their circle, and that are missed, almost universally, until the window for acting on them has already closed. Sign 5 is the one that should disturb you most. Not because it's the most dramatic, it isn't, but because it looks, almost perfectly, like someone who cares about you deeply. Why the friendly threat is the deadliest before we go into the 5 signs specifically, it's worth pausing on a mechanism that makes all of them so consistently overlooked. Human beings are wired, at a very deep level, to resolve ambiguity in favor of the more comfortable interpretation. When a piece of information could mean something benign or something threatening, and the evidence doesn't clearly force one conclusion over the other, we default, almost automatically, toward the benign reading. Psychologists call this optimism bias, and in most contexts, it serves us reasonably well. It keeps us from becoming paralyzed by suspicion of every interaction. It makes daily social life functional. But it also creates a specific and exploitable vulnerability. People who intend harm towards someone in their immediate circle understand, consciously or intuitively, that ambiguity is their greatest asset. As long as each individual behavior can be explained away, coincidence, personality, anxiety, awkwardness, the pattern underneath it never gets examined as a pattern. It gets examined piece by piece, and piece by piece, each fragment looks like nothing. The Stoics were remarkably direct about this particular failure mode. Epictetus taught that wisdom begins not with having the right answers, but with asking the right questions. Specifically, the questions we most prefer not to ask, because the answers might require us to act. The question we avoid in these situations is almost always the same. What is the most honest interpretation of what I'm actually observing, stripped of my preference for this person to be who I think they are? That question is harder to ask than it sounds. Because the people we're describing are often people we've trusted, people who know us, people whose company we've genuinely enjoyed. The cognitive dissonance of holding, "This person knows my coffee order and always seems happy to see me," alongside, "This person may be mapping my life for a reason I don't want to think about," is genuinely uncomfortable. And discomfort, unless we've specifically trained ourselves to sit with it, tends to resolve itself in favor of the less threatening option. What follows are 5 patterns that, taken individually, can each be explained away. Taken together, or even in combinations of 2 or 3, they constitute a signal worth acting on, regardless of how uncomfortable the action feels. Sign 1. The silent observer. There is a specific kind of attention that feels, at first, like genuine interest in you as a person. They remember things. The name of your sister, the project you mentioned 3 weeks ago that wasn't going well, the restaurant you said you wanted to try. They ask follow-up questions that demonstrate they were actually listening last time. It feels good to be remembered like that. Most of us aren't remembered like that. The distinction that matters, and it's subtle enough that most people miss it until they're looking back on it, is the difference between someone who remembers things because they care about you and someone who remembers things because they're building a file. The first type asks follow-up questions because they're curious about how you're doing. The second type asks follow-up questions to fill in gaps in their operational picture of your life. Your schedule. Your routines. The windows in your day when you're predictably somewhere specific and predictably alone. The relationships you're closest to and the ones that are currently strained. A woman named Christine, a mid-level manager in her mid-30s, noticed, gradually, that her former partner seemed to know where she'd be before she arrived. After their relationship ended, she'd changed her gym, varied her routes, started using different stores in different neighborhoods. None of it mattered. He appeared anyway, never confrontational, never making a scene, just present. Reliably, persistently present. Her friends told her he was struggling to move on. She wanted to believe that too. What she eventually understood, and what her friends, through the generous lens of the more comfortable interpretation, had missed, was that what looked like obsession was actually something colder. Obsession is about connection, about the desperate need for proximity to someone you've lost. What he was doing wasn't about connection. It was about information. About maintaining precise knowledge of her location, her patterns, her vulnerabilities at a time of his choosing. The Stoic framework Epictetus established for navigating exactly this kind of situation is deceptively simple. Your instincts are not noise. They are data. When something in your environment disrupts your sense of order, when a pattern stops looking like coincidence, but you can't immediately articulate why, that disruption is your mind processing something your conscious attention hasn't caught up to yet. The wise response is not to dismiss it as overthinking. It's to investigate it, quietly and carefully, before you decide it's nothing. We live, now, in an environment that makes this kind of surveillance dramatically easier than it's ever been. Social media makes our routines semi-public. Mutual friends share information innocuously, without any awareness they're sharing it. Our digital footprints, check-ins, tagged photos, publicly visible schedules, give a patient observer significant intelligence without any direct interaction required. The predatory person who knows where you'll be isn't necessarily watching you from a van down the street. They're watching your Instagram stories and talking to the people you both know. The practical implication is worth naming directly. If someone seems to know the texture of your daily life in ways that outrun what you've actually shared with them, that's a data point. If their presence in spaces you frequent seems to track your movements in ways that feel, in the gut, like something more than coincidence, that's a data point. 2 data points of that kind, in the same person, at a minimum, deserve your attention, not your reassurance. Sign 2. The Saboteur Strategy. There's a study in social psychology that should make everyone slightly more careful about their information environment. When a person hears something negative about someone else, even something later proven false, their perception of that person is measurably and persistently altered. The correction rarely undoes the damage. The first story lodges somewhere the correction can't fully reach. The person operating what I call the Saboteur Strategy understands this, at some level, with precision. They're not interested in a direct confrontation with you. Direct confrontation is risky and visible and can be defended against. What they want is to do something considerably more difficult to defend against. They want to erode the ground under you, quietly, so that when the moment comes, or when they engineer the moment, you're standing alone on soil that's been loosened for months. The mechanics of this are less dramatic and more insidious than most people imagine. It rarely sounds like a formal accusation. It sounds like a concerned friend telling your mutual colleague that they've been a little worried about you lately. You seem stressed. Seems like you haven't been yourself. It sounds like a passing comment to your boss about how you seemed off in a recent meeting. It sounds like a seed planted in a private conversation, not a claim, because claims can be refuted, but an implication, a raised eyebrow, and I'm not saying anything, I don't know. Each individual instance is small enough to dismiss. Each can be attributed to genuine concern, or miscommunication, or someone having a bad day and saying more than they meant to. The pattern underneath only becomes visible once you zoom out far enough to see all of it at once, by which point, in many cases, the damage has already been distributed across enough of your important relationships that the erosion is real, even if the cause is still invisible to you. I knew a man, I'll call him Marcus, who spent almost 8 months in a professional environment where this was happening to him, and couldn't understand why his relationships with colleagues seemed to be cooling. His manager seemed more guarded in their one-on-ones. 2 close friends in the same social circle had become noticeably less available. Nothing dramatic. Just a slow, collective pulling back that he kept trying to explain through his own behavior. Was he being difficult? Had he said something wrong? He turned it inward, which is exactly what the strategy is designed to make you do. When he finally started comparing notes carefully, who had said what, to whom, and when, the architecture of it became visible. One person. Consistent, quiet, patient. Planting small doubts in exactly the right conversations, with exactly the right people, over a long enough period that none of it had seemed connected. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign navigating an environment dense with this kind of maneuvering, political, social, familial, and what he kept returning to in his private writing was a principle that, on the surface, looks like Stoic resignation, but is actually something considerably more practical. Your character, consistently expressed over time, is your most durable protection. Not because it prevents people from trying to undermine you, but because it creates the baseline against which the saboteur's narrative eventually has to compete. Truth, in this framing, isn't a passive thing that eventually surfaces on its own. It's something you actively maintain through the consistency of your own behavior, your documentation of your own work, and the deliberate cultivation of relationships where you are known well enough that a whisper campaign has a harder time gaining purchase. The practical discipline here: document everything. Not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. Emails, decisions, conversations that matter. Keep a record, not because you're building a legal case, but because you're maintaining your own anchor to what actually happened, in an environment where someone is working to replace your account with theirs. Sign 3. The false friend of all 5 signs. This is the one that requires the most internal honesty to recognize, because it arrives dressed as something you want. Most people, at some point in their adult lives, have felt the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being around people without feeling genuinely known by them. You can be in a room full of colleagues, a dinner with friends, a family gathering, and still feel the specific absence of someone who actually sees you. That absence is real, and it creates a real appetite for someone who listens, who asks the right questions, who seems to want to understand you. The person operating this particular pattern knows that appetite exists, and they feed it deliberately with practiced precision. What they do isn't obvious. It doesn't look like manipulation while it's happening. It looks like someone who is unusually interested in you, your history, your relationships, your fears, the things you've been through that you don't usually share in casual conversation. They create a specific atmosphere of safety, of being understood, that makes it feel natural to open up in ways you wouldn't normally. They share things about themselves too, carefully selected things, calibrated to create a sense of mutual vulnerability that isn't actually mutual at all. What they're doing, underneath all of that, is building a target profile. Every piece of information you share becomes, in their hands, a potential tool. Your estrangement from a family member is a wedge they might drive. Your anxiety about your professional standing is a lever. Your past hurt, shared in a moment that felt intimate and safe, is a map of where to apply pressure when the time comes. Seneca wrote something about friendship that has stayed with me longer than most things I've encountered in Stoic literature. He said, "Before you trust someone with your soul, make sure you've actually examined them, not the impression they've constructed for you, but who they actually are under conditions that don't require them to perform." The Stoics used a Greek term, sophrosyne, to describe a kind of wise moderation in all things, including the allocation of trust. Not stinginess, not paranoia, but the discipline of letting trust develop at a pace proportional to evidence rather than proportional to how good someone makes you feel in their presence. The signal worth attending to here is velocity. Genuine friendships, genuine trust, build gradually over time. They accumulate through shared experience, through seeing each other under various conditions, through the slow confirmation that the person in front of you is consistent and safe across different contexts. When someone accelerates that process, when they seem to want access to your inner life very quickly, when the intimacy develops at a speed that slightly outruns the actual shared history, that velocity is information. It doesn't mean everyone who connects with you quickly is dangerous. It means that when the acceleration of intimacy is accompanied by an unusual interest in the specific details of your life, your routines, the people around you, when the questions seem to be mapping something more than just understanding you as a person, the combination warrants attention. True friendship earns access over time. Something else tries to acquire it quickly. Sign 4. Escalating aggression. This one is more visible than the others, and yet it's the one that gets most consistently rationalized away in real time because of the specific way it tends to be packaged. It rarely begins as something you'd recognize immediately as a threat. It begins as a joke. A comment with an edge that gets laughed off, including sometimes by you, because the alternative, taking it seriously, feels like an overreaction. "I could kill you right now," said with a grin after you beat them at something, or a casual remark about knowing how to make someone disappear, delivered with enough levity that the room laughs and moves on. These comments aren't always meaningful. People make dark jokes without dark intent, but they become significant when they're a pattern rather than an isolated moment, and when they're accompanied by other behaviors on this list. What makes this sign specifically dangerous is the psychological mechanism underneath it. Behavioral researchers who study escalating aggression describe it as a conditioning process. The aggressor is testing, gradually, how much you'll accept without resistance. Each normalized boundary crossed makes the next crossing easier, both for them and, psychologically, for you. By the time the behavior has escalated to something clearly threatening, you've been trained, in small increments, to frame each step as not quite bad enough to respond to. Consider what happened with a young woman, I'll call her Leah, who moved into a new apartment complex and met a neighbor who seemed socially awkward but friendly enough. He offered help with groceries. He was reliably present in the elevator. He asked, with what seemed like casual neighborly interest, about her schedule, her work, where she usually spent her evenings. Then, at a small building social event, he made a comment about being good at not leaving evidence, framed as a joke. The room laughed. Leah noted a slight unease but talked herself out of it. Over the following weeks, his physical proximity to her shifted, standing closer than necessary, appearing in hallways at the exact times she usually moved through them. One incident where he blocked her apartment door under the premise of needing to talk. The escalation only became fully visible in retrospect. The hunting knife left on her doormat was not the beginning of the threat. It was the point at which the threat, which had been building in clear stages, finally became undeniable. Leah installed a camera, changed her locks, began documenting every interaction with timestamps. The footage, within weeks, showed him attempting to enter her apartment at 2 in the morning. He was arrested. His apartment contained a detailed written record of her movements, schedules, routes, preferred locations, with a section labeled, in his own handwriting, execution window. The Stoics were not naive about the presence of genuine malice in the world, and they didn't counsel a kind of pastoral optimism about human nature. Seneca's framework for navigating threatening situations was built on a specific principle: forewarned is forearmed. Not because you can prevent everything, but because awareness gives you the window to act before the situation closes around you. If someone in your life makes comments that combine dark themes with laughter as deflection, if they test your physical space and note your reaction, if they seem to be learning how you respond to being made uncomfortable rather than genuinely connecting with you, those behaviors, in combination, are not a personality quirk. They are a sequence. And sequences have trajectories. Sign 5. The patient predator. This is the sign that should stay with you longest after this video ends. Not because it's the most dramatic, it's actually the least dramatic of the 5. Which is precisely why it's the most dangerous. Every other sign on this list has some degree of visible intensity. The surveillance that eventually feels like too much, the sabotage that eventually creates visible damage, the false friendship that eventually moves too fast, the escalating aggression that eventually crosses an obvious line. Each of them, if you're paying attention and looking honestly at what you're seeing, eventually breaks through the surface. The patient predator never breaks through the surface. That is the entire strategy. This is a person who has decided, in some cold and deliberate part of themselves, that they want you gone, out of a position, out of a relationship, out of a life, out of the picture entirely, and has further decided that patience is their greatest asset. They're not going to do anything rash. They're not going to act out of anger, because anger is visible and traceable and creates witnesses. They're going to be the most reliable person in your orbit, potentially for years, while they wait for the precise moment when the conditions are exactly right. They ask about your future plans with what seems like genuine interest in your well-being. When are you moving? What are your travel plans? Is your sister still living with you? Because each answer is a piece of operational intelligence. They build closeness with the people around you, learn your support network's shape, understand who you're close to and who you've had friction with. They do favors, remember anniversaries, check in when you're going through something hard. They construct, patiently and methodically, a version of themselves in your life that is the last person anyone would suspect. This is where the Stoic framework becomes not just philosophically interesting, but practically essential. Epictetus drew a distinction that most people collapse into one. There is what appears, and there is what is. The gap between them is where most human suffering originates, and also where most of our failures of perception originate. We respond to what appears, the warmth, the reliability, the apparent care, and we stop asking what is. We stop asking what actually motivates this pattern of behavior, stripped of the presentation around it. The specific discipline Epictetus was pointing at isn't suspicion of everyone. It's the habit of periodically applying honest scrutiny to the people closest to you, not from a place of fear, but from a place of clarity. Asking, what do I actually know about this person as opposed to what they've presented to me? Where are the gaps in my understanding of their interior life, their history, their motivations? What would I notice if I stripped away the interpretation that they are exactly who they appear to be? A retired detective once described the patient predator to me in terms that have stayed with me. The difference between an angry person and a dangerous person, he said, is that an angry person wants you to know they're angry. A dangerous person wants you to know nothing at all, until they've decided it's time. What you should look for isn't intensity or visible hostility. What you should look for is the specific combination of unusual knowledge of your life, excessive helpfulness, and a quality of calm that never seems genuinely spontaneous, that always seems, just slightly, like it's been chosen. That's a harder thing to identify than a glare from across the room. It requires you to trust a more subtle signal, the sense that something is slightly off in a way you can't immediately articulate. The Stoics called this the inner faculty of rational discernment, and they treated it not as an infallible guide, but as data worth examining rather than reflexively dismissing. The practical guidance: be slow with deep trust, even toward, especially toward, people who seem to be offering it quickly and completely. Keep the private logistics of your life genuinely private. Your travel plans, your routines, the windows in your schedule when you're predictably alone, these are not conversational currency. Share them with the people who've earned access over time, and regard those who seem unusually interested in them as a category of person worth paying closer attention to. You can still be warm. You can still be open. The Stoics were not arguing for a life lived in the defensive crouch of perpetual suspicion. They were arguing for eyes that are genuinely open to what's actually in front of them. Conclusion: what to do with what you now know? Run back through all five. The silent observer, who knows more about your life than they should, appearing in spaces and at times that stop feeling coincidental. The saboteur, moving quietly through your relationships and professional spaces, planting seeds of doubt so carefully that by the time the garden shows what's been grown, you can't immediately trace it back to the gardener. The false friend, building access under the guise of genuine connection, collecting the map of your vulnerabilities with the patience of someone who intends to use it. The escalating aggressor, testing and normalizing, each crossed line making the next one easier, each dark comment packaged in laughter. The patient predator, the warmest face in the room, the most reliable presence in your life, and the most carefully constructed performance of all. If reading through these brought a specific face to mind, if you found yourself applying one or more of these patterns to someone in your actual life right now, I want to say something directly to that recognition. Do not dismiss it. Your instincts are not a personality flaw. They are not anxiety or overthinking or paranoia. They are the accumulated signal of everything you've observed and not yet consciously processed. The Stoics treated that inner signal with enormous respect, not as infallible, but as information that deserves serious examination before it gets dismissed for the sake of comfort. Knowledge, in this context, is not just intellectually interesting. It is, as the Stoics understood in their most practical moments, the difference between acting and being acted upon, between seeing clearly and being surprised. Stay sharp. Trust wisely. And above all, trust yourself.